Now I invite our speaker, Dr. Ankit Sharma from Medanta, the Medicity, Gurgaon.
I invite Dr. Ankit. Dr. Ankit is working as a consultant in the Medanta hospital. He is working in the gastro-critical care ICU, and he is going to speak on the advances in the gastro-critical care, particularly in the acute pancreatitis. Dr. Ankit.
Thank you, sir. A very good afternoon, respected chairpersons, senior faculty members, and dear friends. It's a great honor for me to be here, to be a part of this forum. And I bring greetings from my hospital, Medanta, the Medicity. And I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. In fact, to have the last presentation in a forum of this stature has a lot of advantages, because 90% of the problems which I'll be tackling with my patient in this presentation have already been taken care by the eminent authorities in this field, leaving me to discuss just the disease-specific points. So with this, I'll begin my talk. Typically, such a patient would present with a sudden onset upper abdominal pain, gradually increasing in intensity, radiating to back, may be associated with nausea. The patient might be hemodynamically unstable, showing signs of hypoxemia. Abdomen might show signs, and the typical labs which are shown are represented like increased liver enzymes and LDH. I have typically missed the two most important investigations just to catch your attention here. Now, how do we define acute pancreatitis? The clinical definition, which I have picked from the American Journal of Gastroenterology, which was the latest update available till now, defines it as abdominal, requires two of the following three features: having abdominal pain, which is suggestive strongly of acute pancreatitis, having a serum amylase and or lipase activity at least 3 times greater than the upper limit of normal, with characteristic findings of pancreatic inflammation on transabdominal ultrasonography or on CT scan. The serum amylase alone cannot be used reliably for the diagnosis of acute pancreatitis. The serum lipase is always preferred, but the lipase appears to be more specific and remains elevated longer than amylase after disease presentation, and lipase is more than 90% sensitive for the presentation of acute pancreatitis. The upper limit of normal, greater than 3 to 5 times, may be needed in patients, those who are diabetic or who appear to have a higher median lipase compared to the non-diabetic patients, for unclear reasons. Now, the imaging modality of choice is abdominal ultrasound, which is to be performed at the very beginning, but it is limited because the visualization may be poor because of the underlying gas. The typical findings are of finding a diffusely enlarged hypoechoic pancreas with interstitial edema with extrapancreatic fluid collections. It helps us in detecting the biliary pathology especially, and the future directions hint towards the utilization of contrast-enhanced ultrasound for pancreatic necrosis. The CT scan, the most accurate diagnostic tool, but cannot be performed, should not be performed at the onset. But in those cases where the diagnosis is uncertain, or patients who fail to improve after 48 to 72 hours of the therapy, we might need to go in early. MRI, wherever CT is contraindicated due to renal insufficiency or contrast allergy. It helps in defining the biliary duct anatomy precisely. And this is the typical finding which we see on the CT scan with the bulky pancreas and the collection in the extrapancreatic collections. The endoscopic ultrasound may be most accurate for diagnosing or ruling out biliary causes and may also help in guiding an emergency ERCP. Now, as per the Atlanta classification, the acute pancreatitis has been divided on the basis of necrosis and on the basis of severity. On the basis of necrosis, it has been divided into 2 types: interstitial edematous acute pancreatitis and necrotizing acute pancreatitis. On the basis of severity, they have divided into 3 classifications: the mild acute pancreatitis, where there is absence of organ failure and absence of local complication; moderately severe acute pancreatitis, where local complications and or presence of transient organ failure, that is less than 48 hours, and severe acute pancreatitis with a persistent organ failure for more than 48 hours. But wherever there is features of systemic inflammatory response syndrome are present, those patients should be considered as severe acute pancreatitis and treated accordingly. Now, this is the major differences between the Atlanta revision in 2013. They have laid a lot of stress in defining the organ failure and clearly defining the time period and horizon for the persistent organ failure. For defining the organ failure, they utilize the modified Marshall scoring system, where a score of more than 2 in a system defines the organ failure. And the reason behind doing all this risk stratification is that on the basis of the risk stratification, we can triage our patients, we can delineate which patients should be sent to the ICU, which patients can be managed in the ward. We can appropriately allot the resources which we have in our hospitals. The bedside index of severity is another useful index, where a score of more than 2 within 24 hours is associated with a 7-fold increase in the risk of organ failure and a 10-fold increase in the risk of mortality. Now, if we analyze the value of various scoring systems, we will see that almost all these scores, Apache 2, Ranson score, modified Glasgow score, having a CRP value of more than 150 at 48 hours, their positive predictive value is around 30 to 40, and the negative predictive value is pretty high, with the accuracy ranging from 50 to 60%. But the importance of understanding the risk stratification scores is that early severity prediction is extremely difficult, and often it is very inaccurate, and all the patients initially should be managed as if the disease is severe. Now, on the basis of CT findings, what we see on CT scan is we can delineate the areas of necrosis which may not be evident until 48 to 72 hours. The extent of necrosis is extremely useful in determining the prognosis of acute pancreatitis. Now, the necrosis is defined as a diffuse or focal areas of non-viable pancreatic parenchyma, more than 3 centimeters size or more than 30% of the pancreas. The necrosis can be sterile or infected. Both the patients with sterile necrosis and infected necrosis may develop organ failure. The isolated extrapancreatic necrosis is also included under the term necrotizing pancreatitis. Now, summing up the CT findings, the Balthazar CT severity index is utilized, where the inflammatory process and the necrotic process can be clubbed together and giving it a score from 0 to 10, higher scores indicating a greater severity and more mortality. Now, risk assessment, as I just mentioned, should be performed to stratify patients into higher and lower risk categories to assist triage at admission to the intensive care. Patients with organ failure should be admitted directly to the ICU. Persistent organ failure within the first few days of the disease are extremely high risk of death, with a reported mortality of more than 35 to 50%. Development of infected necrosis among patients with persistent organ failure is associated with extremely high mortality. Now, defining severe acute pancreatitis, the criteria are a Ranson score of more than 3 or more, a Apache 2 score of 8 or more within the first 48 hours, having an organ failure, respiratory, circulatory, renal or gastrointestinal bleeding, with local complications like pancreatic necrosis, abscess or pseudocyst. Mortality risk as high as 40%, and a multidisciplinary care is usually required to manage these patients. Etiology, gallstones and alcohol are found the major reasons, but not infrequently we see hypertriglyceridemia and endocrine causes of hypercalcemia in the ICUs as a cause of acute pancreatitis. And a very apt mnemonic for these causes, a bad time is given. Now, the initial resuscitation. Probably the aggressive hydration has stemmed from the clinical finding that most of these patients are hypovolemic because of causes like vomiting, excessive third spacing. So 250 to 500 ml per hour of isotonic crystalloid solution should be provided to all patients, unless we are dealing with patients who have cardiovascular, renal or other comorbidities. This is included in the standard of care as given in American Journal of Gastroenterology 2013. In a patient with severe volume depletion, hypertension or tachycardia, fluid boluses may be required. Early aggressive intravenous hydration is most beneficial only during the first 12 to 24 hours and may have little benefit beyond this time period. And those patients who do not respond to this initial fluid boluses, IV hydration may not benefit from continued aggressive fluid therapy. Lactated Ringer's solution may be the preferred isotonic solution. Fluid requirement should be continuously reassessed at frequent intervals within 6 hours of admission and thereafter 24 to 48 hours. The goal is to decrease the hematocrit and the blood urea nitrogen to maintain a normal creatinine during the first days of the hospitalization. The flip side of this is the other studies have suggested that aggressive hydration may be associated with an increased morbidity and mortality. And 9 studies which looked at the aggressive versus non-aggressive resuscitation protocols, suggested 4 of them concluded that aggressive approach yielded better results, whereas 5 concluded that non-aggressive approach was better. And the summary of few of these studies was the rapid hemodilution increases the incidence of sepsis within 28 days and in hospital mortality. The hematocrit should be maintained between 30 to 40% in acute response stage. The other study concluded that controlled fluid resuscitation offers better prognosis in patients with severe volume deficit within 72 hours of severe acute pancreatitis onset. Patients with severe acute pancreatitis should receive 1/3 or more of the initial 72 hours fluid estimation deficit during the first 24 hours. So now, how do we define the challenges of fluid administration? What should be the end point of the fluid administration? When should we decide that this patient is going to respond to fluid challenges? Has been covered excellently in the last lectures, so I won't be going into the details of that. Now, this is a typical picture on the day 2 of acute severe pancreatitis being managed in the ICU, with all the paraphernalia of the critical care being utilized on this patient, like advanced hemodynamic monitor, all the vasotropic drugs, advanced FRC module on the ventilator to determine the optimal PEEP, a RRT machine. All these point towards how severe the condition is and how aggressively we need to manage this patient, and how little the time the patient gives us in the initial 24 to 48 hours. If we are able to maintain the macrocirculatory goals, the microcirculatory goals, then we can hope for a positive outcome. Otherwise, the prognosis is grim. Now, the intensive care management revolves around the cardiovascular aspects, like rapid restoration of the intravascular volume, utilization of vasoactive drugs only after the volume resuscitation. The pulmonary aspects of physiotherapy and adequate analgesia, probably in the form of epidural analgesia, going ahead with early pleural fluid drainages, recognition and management of ARDS, utilizing the prone position, utilizing high frequency oscillation at the earliest, utilizing the non-invasive ventilation as soon as we get the picture of developing hypoxemia, the renal aspects, optimization of the hemodynamics, and the early use of renal replacement therapy for nutritional and metabolic optimization. In the gastrointestinal system, regular monitoring for development of intra-abdominal hypertension, which should be suspected in a case of new or worsening organ failure. The pain relief also becomes an extremely important aspect in the management of acute pancreatitis. Epidural analgesia is one of the most effective forms of delivering the pain relief. Reduced systemic opiate requirement is seen with it, may allow spontaneous breathing or an assisted mode if mechanically ventilated, may improve bowel motility, facilitate enteral nutrition, and may reduce the risk of secondary pancreatic infections. Nutrition. Earlier on, patients with acute pancreatitis have traditionally been treated with bowel rest, which included nasogastric suction and keeping them NPO. But bowel rest is a meaningless term, and it is impossible to rest the bowel. Just like trying to rest the bowel by not feeding is akin to inducing an asystole to rest the heart. Theoretical reason why nutrition support in acute pancreatitis becomes extremely important, because these patients are hypercatabolic, hypermetabolic process with increased protein and calorie requirements. Oral intake is almost impossible for a prolonged period. Increased protein losses across the inflamed surfaces mandates the replacement pre-existing protein, calorie malnutrition, and micronutrient deficiencies, usually as a result of ILQ abuse, have to be addressed properly. In mild acute pancreatitis, oral feedings can be started immediately if there is no nausea and vomiting and abdominal pain has resolved. Initiation of feeding with a low-fat solid diet appears as safe as clear liquid diet. In severe acute pancreatitis, enteral nutrition is recommended to prevent the infectious complication so as to enhance the mucosal barrier in the gut. Parenteral nutrition should be avoided at all costs unless the enteral route is not available, not tolerated, or not meeting the calorie requirements. Nasogastric delivery and nasogingival delivery of enteral feeding appears to be comparable in efficacy and safety. Hence, there is no need to rush the patient for inserting an NG tube. An NG tube can do as well. This is an article published in New England Journal of Medicine comparing multi-center randomized control trial comparing early nasogastric tube feeding with oral diet at 72 hours after presentation to the emergency department in a patient with acute pancreatitis, and the trial did not show the superiority of early nasogastric tube feeding when it was compared with an oral diet after 72 hours, probably challenging our concept of enhancing the mucosal barrier of the gut by promoting early enteral feeding. So the complications of the nutritional therapy may be hyperglycemia, hypertriglyceridemia, exacerbation of the disease process, gut intolerance. So the monitoring of bowel distension, abdominal pressure, residual jejunal volume, and diarrhea have to be done continuously. Titration of the enteral infusion rates have to be done according to the residual. Use of prokinetics enema can be undertaken in order to facilitate the passage of the feed. Now this is in nutshell the algorithm for utilizing the nutritional therapy, just focusing on to utilize the gut wherever it is possible, and if it is not possible to utilize the gut, try and make it usable. Now the management of biliary pancreatitis, the pathogenesis involves temporary or persistent obstruction of the sphincter of Oddi. The rationale for biliary bile duct clearance, the treatment revolves around the prompt removal of the impacted stone and attenuate the inflammatory response involved. Now this requires prompt identification. The ultrasonography is the treatment imaging modality of choice. 85% sensitivity for cholelithiasis and pancreatitis. Endoscopic ultrasound, ERCP and MRCP are the other modalities which should be promptly utilized. Now timing of ERCP has been a matter of debate. Patients with acute pancreatitis and concurrent acute cholangitis should undergo ERCP within 24 hours of admission. Not needed early in most patients with gallstones pancreatitis who lack laboratory or clinical evidence of ongoing biliary obstruction. But in the absence of cholangitis or jaundice, MRCP or endoscopic ultrasound rather than diagnostic ERCP should be used to screen for choledocholithiasis. Now during the course in biliary pancreatitis, progressive increase in serum bilirubin, increase in LFT and persistent dilatation of the common bile duct become the important reasons for performing an ERCP in acute pancreatitis. Gallbladder should be tackled with adequately. Early removal of the gallbladder to avoid recurrence. Recurrence rates around 30% after 3 months. The laparoscopic approach seems to be feasible and safe. Infection. The routine use of prophylactic antibiotic has been shunned totally in patients with severe acute pancreatitis. The usual scenario is when a patient presents to us in hemodynamically unstable condition, giving us all the pictures of septicemia, the hit hard, hit fast comes into our mind, and we are prompted to utilize the highest category of drugs, a gram-positive, gram-negative, giving teicoplanin along with meropenem. But this whole utilization of drugs on the prophylactic basis should be totally abandoned. Antibiotics should be given only for an extrapancreatic infection such as cholangitis or catheter-acquired infection, bacteremia, UTIs and pneumonias. The use of antibiotics in patients with sterile necrosis to prevent the development of infected necrosis is no longer recommended. Now the infected necrosis should be considered in patients with pancreatic or extrapancreatic necrosis who deteriorate or fail to improve after 10 days of hospitalization. Initial CD-guided aspiration, further gram staining and culture to guide the use of appropriate antibiotics should be undertaken. Empirical use of antibiotics after obtaining necessary cultures without CDFNA can be given, because at this time we can expect the infection process to take over in the course of the disease. This is an algorithm to utilize wherever we need to prescribe the antibiotics, whether the decision for prescribing the antibiotics can be just, this is just the algorithm which I discussed in the previous slide. Now, in patients with infected necrosis, the choice of antibiotic should be such that they should be able to penetrate the pancreatic necrosis, and the obvious choices are utilizing carbapenems, quinolones and metronidazole. The routine administration of antifungal agents along with prophylactic or therapeutic antibiotics is not recommended. Antibiotics alone can lead to resolution of infection, and in selected patients can lead to avoidance of surgery as well. Now, the prompt de-escalation or discontinuation based on the basis of the results of culture sensitivity, gram staining, helping us in guiding the initial therapy, and utilization of the local antibiogram in order to select the initial choice of antibiotics should be undertaken. Now, treatment of sterile necrosis, there is now an increasing consensus that patients with sterile necrosis should continue to be managed medically during the first few weeks for the following reason. Delay in surgical necrosectomy and at times total avoidance of surgery can and does result in less morbidity and mortality than early surgical debridement. Now, percutaneous drainage should now be accepted as a standard of care. Undertaken in non-loculated peripheral fluid collection and abscesses can be done bedside utilizing a mobile ultrasound machine as a temporary measure in critically ill patients until more formal surgical debridement may be carried out. transgastric or transduodenal endoscopic approach may be used as the alternatives. The surgical interventions, the indications for performing surgery, infected pancreatic necrosis even with high index of suspicion, severe retroperitoneal hemorrhage, acute abdomen presenting with signs of peritonitis, biliary obstruction in case of failure of endoscopic sphincterotomy, abdominal compartment syndrome where percutaneous or other drainage techniques are not successful. The surgical intervention in stable patients with infected necrosis, surgical radiological endoscopic drainage should be delayed by preferably 4 weeks to allow the development of walled-off pancreatic necrosis. But in unstable patient with infected necrosis, worsening organ failure, treatment of choice is surgical debridement. Minimally invasive procedures are now preferred rather than open necrosectomy. The step-up approach has been advocated in recent studies published in the journal Pancreas in a multi-center randomized controlled trial from Netherlands. A step-up approach to management of infected necrosis was compared to open necrosectomy. It involved the placement of PCD catheters in addition to treatment with antibiotics. Patient whose clinical condition failed to improve within 72 hours, minimally invasive debridement was performed by a retroperitoneal approach, and the step-up approach reduced major complications and mortality by 29% in comparison to the traditional open necrosectomy approach. Local complications like hemorrhage, erosion of vessels by proteases, the intervention of choice, a CT scan can identify the approximate location and massive retroperitoneal bleeding, followed by angiography to localize the source of bleeding and hemostasis with embolization, and in case failed angiographic occlusion, surgery is indicated. Perforation mechanism is extension of necrosis in the mesocolon, secondary vessel thrombosis and ischemia. Again, the choice of imaging a CT scan followed by colectomy or loop ileostomy. Pseudocyst formation, collection of pancreatic juice enclosed by granulation tissue. The treatment choices: drainage, percutaneous, surgical or preferably endoscopic. Pancreatic fistulas result from unsealed rupture of pancreatic duct. Minor leaks are treated conservatively with drainage and utilizing drugs like somatostatin or octreotide. Major rupture may require resection, jejunal anastomosis or endoscopic stenting. Now I will conclude my presentation by the following slide. The risk stratification plays a key role in the management of patient with acute pancreatitis, helping us into triage a patient and using our resources adequately so as to give the benefit to the patient who is most seriously affected by the disease. Abandon concepts like bowel rest, empirical antibiotics, peritoneal lavage and aggressive fluid therapy, initiation of early enteral nutrition, utilizing less aggressive fluid resuscitation, a conservative and minimally invasive approach to necrotizing pancreatitis, and a step-up approach to management of infected necrosis. The upcoming modalities which have till now been included in the standard of care are the utilization of extracorporeal filtration of cytokines, utilizing filters which can absorb these cytokines and tide over the initial surge phase. We have been using these filters, but the results are still inconclusive and they have not been validated and they have not been included in any standard of care so far. The utilization of trypsin inhibitors like ulinastatin, they are being used widely. The results are promising, but still because of their non-inclusion into the standard of care, I'm not mentioned into the main presentation. And the best tools for accurate hemodynamic assessment, fluid responsiveness and the fluid tolerance have been the topic of debate throughout the conference today. What we are utilizing at our center is the extravascular lung water estimation, combining it together with ultrasound findings to limit and to evaluate the fluid responsiveness in our patients so as to achieve the micro and the macro circulatory goals. Thank you for your kind attention, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ankit, for a very comprehensive presentation of management of acute pancreatitis and sticking to your time also. Are there any questions from the floor of the house? Yes.
Infected necrosis, which carbapenem and which your preferences?
So the carbapenem which we use is meropenem, unless there is a neurological involvement where we go in for a doripenem. Meropenem in adequate doses, like 2 grams IV 8 hourly is adequate, and it has been shown if given in an infusion of 3 hours, the adequate tissue levels are achieved by utilizing this drug. wherever we are utilizing renal replacement therapy, 2 hours prior to the therapy, a bolus dose, and then reduced dosage according to the creatinine clearance after the therapy is being utilized.
You asked which quinolone and which carbapenem. Carbapenem we answered.
I want to clarify. I may be a bit back in history, but in one of the surgical books, I read that imipenem is to be preferred. In belly and love, and not surgical any particular.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Trials are mostly limited to imipenem, you are very right, and ciprofloxacin. But our own local antibiogram shows, because of misuse of ciprofloxacin has almost lost its efficacy. So we, as a matter of policy, we use moxifloxacin as quinolone of choice. We don't have any rationale for this. This is our own practice.
I have a question.
Right.
When you have said negative predictive value,
Right.
I mean you have shown the sensitivity of around 90%. What does it mean?
So if these scores are not falling into that criteria, like Ranson score is more than 3. If it is not more than 3, then we can rest assured that acute pancreatitis might not be there. So the negative predictive value is ruling out the presence of the disease. In that way it becomes useful, but our main intention is to detect out even at the cost of lower specificity so as to not to miss those patients. So that is why to err on the side of considering these patients to be suffering from acute pancreatitis and take them to the ICU, give them intense monitoring, that is the value. But negative predictive value doesn't hold too much of a meaning in this particular case, because a lapse of 12 to 14 hours, we generally see that the multi-organ failure is already set in, and then to revive these patients back is a hell of a job.
And second, you have said that in severe pancreatitis, if this is not infective, we don't have to use antibiotics. What it's non-infective.
Exactly.
So
Not beyond 2 to 4 weeks. We can give it safe time of 2 to 4 weeks. We don't have any features of worsening organ failure, worsening hemodynamic parameters. The sterile necrosis is lying there. We can safely hold on to the upgradation of the antibiotics or stepping up of the antibiotics till that time.
So, I mean, are you bold enough not to prescribe antibiotics?
So we do it. We do it in our setup for the first 2 weeks. If we don't have any associated organ failure, we do not step up the antibiotics beyond utilizing. We don't go ahead with the step up of the antibiotics.
What do you mean, stepping up or not prescribing antibiotics?
So initially, when the patient comes to us and we are sure about the SIRS response is there, it is like a good prompt, like to go ahead with a strong antibiotic, but we do not prescribe these patients any antibiotics at that particular time.
Just one. About this antibiotics, as far as normally what we practice is, because there is very evidence is not very clear, even in the severe necrotizing pancreatitis also. So there is no point starting antibiotics, and as a matter of policy, we don't give antibiotics before usually 7 to 10 days, unless there is other things, like sometimes some patient is having other infective source other than pancreatitis.
Absolutely,
so
we follow the same thing.
Exactly, and another thing is, if it is possible, because right now interventional radiology, either ultrasonography or the CT guided sampling is possible. So if it is possible, it is always better to go for that, considering the quite a significant proportion of patient is having resistant type. What is the type of resistant? So that's why it is very important. Because the problem is, most of these patients later on, and the 3rd, 4th week onwards, they suffer from some Acinetobacter that is usually resistant carbapenem producer, particularly the chest infection. So chest infection, that is very common, and that may be because of the too much use of this carbapenem. So that's why I think it is better that it should not be used.
Like, so in our setup, the gram-negative bugs which we detect eventually in cases of infected collections, they are usually resistant to even carbapenems, leaving us only with the choice of utilizing colistin and tigecycline. So that is a scenario which we are dealing with. Utilizing the antibiotics right from the beginning will only hasten up the resistance pattern and further worsen up the chances of survival in these patients. So we don't go ahead unless we have a strong hint or a suspicion about the infection persisting, and we don't go in for the antibiotics initially. Right. Right.
Just give. What is your experience?
So in two particular conditions we have been using it. One is severe acute pancreatitis. Initially we are using it, and the other cases are like in which the surge response sets up after a surgery like esophageectomy or Whipple surgery. In these cases, we are utilizing ulinastatin in a dose of 2 lakh unit bi-daily for 5 days. What we have seen so far is, in few of the patients, the inotropic requirement starts to de-escalate at the 24th hour. So that prompted us to undertake internal data collection so as to have a good database. Then we can actually pinpoint whether this finding is statistically significant or not. But after that finding, we have made it almost a routine pattern to utilize this drug. Even though it might not turn out or translate into a significant asset, but still the inotropic de-escalation was the main force behind including this into our routine practice.
Dr. Ankit, if I'm sure you must be realizing the entire exercise is in risk stratification.
Absolutely.
They have all those criteria, Ranson, Balthazar, Apache, and organ failure criteria. Now, the very fact that there are many criteria itself indicates that there is no adequate criteria.
No adequate criteria, sir.
So, Ranson is quite clumsy, and I was quite happy to read recently that even Ranson used to carry a card in his pocket to remember all those parameters. So, nobody remembers it. Apache is a computer-based criteria.
Absolutely, sir.
Balthazar is a radiological criteria. I think clinical assessment is the best criteria organ. Are you aware of any single parameter which is emerging as possible, parameter which might tell us which is severe pancreatitis or mild pancreatitis?
So CRP value at the 48th hour was utilized as a single criteria, but even the specificity and sensitivity of that criteria was questioned. And the negative predictive value is again high, but specificity is low.
What about the renal function? What about the renal function? The only factor that I have found useful in clinical practice is the presence or absence of organ failure.
Absolutely. The organ failure is the one which...
And what about the renal function?
That comes under the modified Marshall score for defining the organ failure.
You appeared a little more enthusiastic about ERCP. Doing ERCP in a patient with acute pancreatitis, they really need very courageous person.
No.
So when do your gastroenterologist do ERCP in acute biliary pancreatitis?
So actually, the guidelines which I have, these are the ones which I formally picked up for the sake of completion of the article, and the ERCP is definitely not the modality of choice, and only in very few selected cases to relieve the obstruction probably they are undergoing it.
And what is your policy about acute biliary pancreatitis? When do you call them back for cholecystectomy, or what is your timeline? 6 weeks after.
Those who are not able to conduct the retroperitoneal approach for the necrosectomy.
Right, sir.
What are the alternative step-up approaches? One you said that we have to go first for the PCT,
then minimally invasive
procedures, and then finally
third is the
leprotomy.
So is the retroperitoneal approach is the minimally invasive? That is what you are talking about.
This is what is recommended in the literature, sir. As per the literature.
How many people are doing it, retroperitoneal necrosectomy in India?
So I'm actually not.
Yeah, I got it. They are doing it. Because I got a patient from transfer from Action College Hospital recently who has had this approach done. It's a different matter that they did not improve. Actually, in the process of doing it, they take the the biodata, and he has come to us. So maybe the learning stage is going on and the learning curve is there, but it has become one of the standard practices of care. I mean, forget about Gangaram, this patient was transferred from Action Neurology Hospital, and they had the courage to do it. And actually the patient did improve in the initial stage, because only later on 4-5 days he was discharged. He was discharged home, he came back with biliary leak and septic shock.
So as a critical care physician, we have really picked up the art of performing the bedside drainages, utilizing the mobile ultrasound machine and pigtail catheter insertions and the Malicot insertions. So that is probably helping us in cutting short the delay time and the lag time in taking the patient to the IR, and that 6 to 8 hours period saved does translate into the mortality benefit. These patients show much better recovery on just at the onset of the detection of the fluid in a septicemic case with a high procalcitonin, where we go in and drain those fluids and get them culture sensitivity done. They definitely show an edge above the patients who are managed more conservatively.
Are you training them to go through the stomach into the pancreatic bed?
We have done it, sir. We do it. We do it quite often, in fact.
In your experience, if you are doing, say, 100 PCDs in a year,
Maybe more.
how many of them you are going to do by some guidance, and for how many of them you have to use the CT?
So, like if I...
1:9 time.
Definitely, sir. Like it is, there's hardly a case where we say give up on. It can be easily done, sir. It is easily done. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.